The text message arrived at 7:02 a.m. I was alone in a hotel room in Rome, on the trip of a lifetime I had paid for in my late husband's memory. The morning light was just beginning to stream through the sheer curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. My daughter's words glowed on the screen, a cold digital blade to the heart. "You are not joining us. Tom thinks it's better if we go on ahead to Florence. We have the car. The front desk can call you a taxi to the airport." Sorry. That one word, tacked on at the end like an afterthought, was the cruelest cut of all. They had left me, stranded in a foreign country with nothing but my grief, a suitcase full of clothes, and the sudden, gut-wrenching realization that I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. But as the shock subsided, something else took its place. A cold, quiet rage. They thought they had left a helpless old woman behind. They had no idea they had just unleashed a force of nature. You won't believe what happened next. Before we continue this story, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments if you've ever dealt with a difficult son-in-law. This trip was supposed to be a healing, a final, beautiful tribute to Richard, my husband of 42 years. For a decade, he had kept a tattered travel guide to Italy on his nightstand, its pages filled with his neat, penciled-in notes and dog-eared corners marking the places he dreamed of seeing. The Uffizi Gallery in Florence, a gondola ride through the canals of Venice, and most of all, the ancient, hallowed stones of the Roman Forum. "One day, Helen," he'd say, his eyes shining with a dreamer's light, "we'll walk where the Caesars walked, the whole family." But one day never came. Cancer, a swift and merciless thief, stole him from me 2 years ago, leaving behind a silence in our home that was louder than any sound. And in that silence, his dream became my mission. So I took our life savings, the money we had carefully put away for a comfortable, quiet retirement together, and I planned his trip. I would take our only daughter, Jessica, and her husband of 3 years, Tom. I would walk where the Caesars walked, and Richard would walk with me in my heart. It would be a pilgrimage, a way to say a final, proper goodbye and to bring our fractured family closer in the process. From the moment they met me at the airport, however, I sensed the fault line. Jessica, my vibrant, independent daughter, seemed diminished, her light dimmed by the looming presence of her husband. Tom was a man who moved through the world with the brusque, entitled confidence of someone who has never been told no. He was a portfolio manager, and he evaluated everything, art, food, historical sites, not on its intrinsic beauty or significance, but on its monetary value and its potential as a status symbol. Our first 3 days in Rome were a masterclass in passive aggression. I had booked us into a charming, historic hotel near the Pantheon, a place Richard would have adored for its authenticity. Tom's first comment as he surveyed the antique furniture was, "Quaint. I'll have to check the Wi-Fi speed. I have a market report to file." At dinner that first night, in a small trattoria I'd chosen for its traditional Roman cuisine, he'd loudly complained about the lack of a Wagyu beef option on the menu. Jessica, instead of managing her husband's boorish behavior, had simply given me an apologetic shrug. "Tom's a bit of a foodie, Mom," she'd said, as if his rudeness was a charming quirk and my choice was a provincial failure. Everywhere we went, I felt like a tour guide to a pair of bored, resentful teenagers. I'd stand before the Colosseum, my heart aching with the weight of history and the memory of Richard's excitement, and try to share a fact from his guidebook. Tom would interrupt, pointing his phone at the structure. "The real moneymaker here isn't the history," he'd say. "It's the tourism logistics. The ticketing, the concessions, that's a billion-dollar enterprise." He saw the world not as a place of wonder, but as a series of assets to be leveraged. And it was becoming increasingly clear, was not an asset. I was a liability, an emotional and financial drain on his time with his wife. The breaking point came on our third night. The next day I had pre-booked tickets, non-refundable of course, for the Borghese Gallery and Museum. It was the one place Richard had underlined in red ink in his guide. "The sculptures," he had written in the margin, "they say they're so real they look like they're still breathing." I announced the plan over dinner, my voice full of a fragile excitement I hadn't felt in years. Tom didn't even look up from his phone. "Can't do it," he said. "I found a designer outlet about an hour outside of Rome. They have the new line of Brioni suits. I booked a private showing for tomorrow morning." I stared at him, my fork hovering over my pasta. "A private showing, Tom. The tickets for the gallery are already paid for. It was the one place Richard wanted to see most of all." He finally looked at me, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. Helen, with all due respect, Richard's not here. We are. And frankly, I could use a break from dusty old statues. Jessica wants to look at some handbags anyway. We'll need the rental car. The rental car that I had paid for. He was telling me, not asking, that my tribute to my dead husband was being canceled in favor of a shopping spree. No, I said, the word quiet but firm. I understand if you and Jessica don't want to go. You are free to do as you please. But the car is for the Borghese Gallery. It was the plan. Tom threw his napkin down on the table. This is exactly what I'm talking about, Jess, he said, turning to his wife. She's controlling this whole trip. It's not a vacation, it's the Helen and Richard Memorial Tour. We're just props. I looked at my daughter, my heart pleading with her to understand, to defend me, to defend her father's memory. But the look on her face was one of pure, frustrated annoyance. At me. Mom, please don't make this a thing, she said, her voice sharp. Tom's right. Every single thing we've done has been about Dad. It's depressing. Can't we just have one day of fun? We're in Italy. Why do you have to make everything so heavy? The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Depressing, heavy. My grief, my love, my attempt to honor her father was a burden to her. It was ruining her fun. I looked from my daughter's resentful face to my son-in-law's triumphant smirk. I was outnumbered. Fine, I whispered, the fight draining out of me. Do whatever you want. I stood up, leaving my half-eaten dinner, and walked back to the hotel alone, the sound of their renewed, cheerful chatter chasing me down the ancient cobblestone street. I cried myself to sleep, a quiet, hopeless grief for a husband who was gone and a daughter I no longer recognized. I woke the next morning with a heavy heart, assuming a day of cold shoulders and tense silence lay ahead. I never, in my wildest nightmares, imagined I would wake up abandoned. But there it was, the text on my phone. Sorry. The final, dismissive nail in the coffin of the family I thought I had. For a full 10 minutes, I did not move. I simply sat on the edge of the lavishly upholstered bed, the phone still glowing in my hand, and let the reality of the message wash over me. It was a cold, methodical tide, seeping into every part of my being. Abandoned. The word itself felt archaic, something out of a Victorian novel, not a term to be applied to a 64-year-old woman in the heart of Rome. My first instinct was a desperate, panicked denial. It had to be a joke. A cruel, terrible joke. My fingers, clumsy and trembling, dialed Jessica's number. The call went immediately to voicemail, a cheerful, generic message that felt like a slap in the face. I tried Tom's number. The same result. They had turned off their phones, or more likely, they had blocked my number. The finality of it was absolute. The shock began to recede, replaced by a wave of crushing physical grief. My body started to shake, a deep internal tremor I couldn't control. I thought of Richard, of his fierce, protective love for our daughter. He would never have believed her capable of such a thing. This casual, calculated cruelty was not the Jessica he had known. It was a monstrous version, remolded in Tom's image. The tears came then, hot and silent, tracking paths down my cheeks. I was crying not just for myself, but for the daughter I had lost, and for the husband whose memory they had so carelessly desecrated. After what felt like an eternity, a new feeling began to push through the grief. Humiliation. The hotel staff. They had seen us as a family. They had smiled at us, made our dinner reservations, wished us a buona sera. Now I had to walk down to the front desk alone and face their polite, professional pity. I splashed cold water on my face, the woman in the ornate mirror looking back at me a stranger, pale, red-eyed, and utterly broken. I forced myself to breathe, to put one foot in front of the other. As I walked to the front desk, the cheerful clerk, a young man named Marco, smiled at me. "Good morning, Mrs. Davison. I trust you slept well. Have your daughter and her husband already left for the day?" The lie tasted like ash in my mouth. "Yes, Marco," I said, forcing a brittle smile. "They had a very early start, a last-minute change of plans." My voice sounded thin and unconvincing to my own ears, but he simply nodded. "Of course, will you be needing a taxi later?" "Perhaps," I murmured, my mind a blank slate of panic. It was then I realized the full, logistical nightmare of my situation. The rental car was gone. The printed vouchers for the next 2 hotels in Florence and Venice, which I had so trustingly given to Jessica to keep in her purse, were also gone. Why hadn't just removed themselves? They had systematically dismantled my ability to follow the itinerary I had so meticulously planned and paid for. Back in my room, a new, colder fear began to set in. My finances. Had they taken money? I fumbled with my tablet, my fingers shaking as I logged into my bank account. And then I saw it. The balance was exactly as it should be. The substantial sum I had moved into my checking account for the trip, enough to cover 5-star hotels, first-class train tickets, and extravagant meals for 3 people for 2 weeks, was untouched. And this somehow was the cruelest cut of all. They hadn't robbed me. They didn't want my money, not directly. They just didn't want me. My presence was a tax on their enjoyment, a debt they were no longer willing to pay. They had discarded me as one would discard a piece of luggage that had become too heavy to carry. I looked around the beautiful, opulent hotel room that suddenly felt like the most expensive prison cell in the world. I could see 2 paths stretching out before me. I could call the airline, book the first flight back home, and retreat to my quiet, empty house to lick my wounds, forever branded by this humiliation. Or I could do something else. The thought was a small, flickering ember in the cold darkness of my despair. I thought of Richard's guidebook, still sitting on the nightstand. I thought of his penciled-in notes, his dreams, and I thought of the Borghese Gallery. With a resolve I didn't know I possessed, I stood up, showered, and dressed. I put on my most comfortable walking shoes and my favorite silk scarf, the one Richard had given me for our last anniversary. I still had my single, prepaid ticket on my phone. I walked out of the hotel, head held high, and took a taxi through the vibrant, chaotic streets of Rome. I arrived at the gallery feeling like a ghost, an observer detached from my own life. I walked through the magnificent rooms, surrounded by the hushed reverence of the other patrons. I saw masterpieces by Raphael and Caravaggio, their beauty a distant, abstract concept. And then I walked into the room that held Bernini's sculptures. I stood before his Apollo and Daphne. I saw the raw, desperate terror on Daphne's face as her body began to transform, her fingers sprouting into leaves, her toes taking root in the earth as she escaped the god's unwanted grasp. It was a story of a woman escaping a predator by becoming something stronger, something immovable. And then I saw the one Richard had written about, the rape of Proserpina. I saw the brutal strength of Pluto, his fingers digging into the soft marble of Proserpina's thigh with a realism that made me gasp. But I also saw her face a mask of anguish, tears carved from stone as she fought back, pushing her hand with all her might against the god's face. She was not a passive victim. She was a fighter. Richard's note had said the statues looked like they were still breathing, and in that moment I understood. For 2 years I had been holding my breath, living in the shadow of my grief. I had made this trip a memorial, a pilgrimage to the past. Jessica was right about one thing: it had been heavy. I had been trying to keep Richard alive by embalming his memory. But these statues, these breathtaking, 400-year-old pieces of rock, were more alive than I had been in years. They were a testament not just to beauty, but to struggle, to transformation, to the fierce, unyielding will to survive. A single tear escaped and rolled down my cheek, but it was not a tear of grief or self-pity. It was a tear of release. I left the gallery a different woman than the one who had entered. The broken, abandoned widow was gone. In her place was someone new, someone whose spine was forged from the same resilience as the breathing marble. This was no longer Richard's trip. It was my trip. I walked to a nearby cafe, sat at an outdoor table in the warm Roman sun, and ordered a glass of the best Prosecco on the menu. Then I took out my phone. I saw Jessica's name, the unanswered calls. I didn't delete the contact. I simply silenced it. I took back my peace. I opened my banking app and looked at the number. It was a war chest. They had left a discarded queen on the battlefield, not realizing they had left her with the entire kingdom's treasury. I began to make new plans. Not their plans, but mine. First-class train ticket to Florence, absolutely. A room with a view of the Arno, of course. I would see the Uffizi. I would see Venice. I would do it all, not as a widow mourning a ghost, but as a woman reclaiming her own life. Finally, I opened my text messages and selected the conversation with my daughter. I deleted the draft I had written in my head, the angry accusations, the heartbroken pleas. I typed a new message, my fingers steady and sure. 6 simple words. Message received, have a wonderful life. I hit send. Then I took a long, slow sip of my Prosecco, the bubbles dank. Ing on my tongue, It tasted of freedom. They thought the story was over, but I was about to start a new chapter, and this one I would write myself. The journey from Rome to Florence was a revelation. Seated in a plush, oversized armchair in the first-class carriage of a high-speed train, the Italian countryside blurring past my window in a beautiful watercolor of cypress trees and terracotta roofs, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. There were no tense negotiations about where to stop for lunch, no passive-aggressive sighs from my son-in-law, no anxious glances from a daughter trying to appease a perpetually dissatisfied husband. There was only the gentle rhythm of the train, the smooth glide over the tracks, and the quiet, expansive freedom of my own thoughts. The 2-hour trip felt like a journey between two different lives. I had boarded the train in Rome as a victim, a woman reeling from a profound betrayal. I stepped onto the platform in Florence as Helen, a woman on an adventure of her own making. My first act of rebellion was to rip up the itinerary they had stolen. I had no idea which hotel they had the vouchers for, and I found I didn't care. They had expected me to be stranded, to be helpless. They had underestimated me. I walked to the official taxi stand, my back straight, and gave the driver the name of a hotel I had only ever read about in glossy travel magazines, a place Richard and I had considered far too extravagant for our sensible budget. The St. Regis, Florence, a palace on the banks of the Arno. As the taxi pulled up to the magnificent facade, a liveried doorman rushing to open my door and take my bags, I felt a flicker of the old, frugal guilt. This was reckless. This was irresponsible. But then I thought of Tom's Brioni suits and Jessica's designer handbags, all funded by my generosity and their casual cruelty. The guilt vanished, replaced by a delicious sense of justice. The suite they gave me was breathtaking. It wasn't just a room. It was a small apartment, decorated in Florentine silks and antiques, with a marble bathroom the size of my bedroom back home. And the view through the grand, floor-to-ceiling windows was a picture-perfect panorama of the Arno River, the terracotta dome of the Duomo visible in the distance. I stood there for a long time, just looking, letting the sheer, unapologetic beauty of it all wash over me. They had left me in a prison of their making in Rome. I had just checked myself into a palace. I unpacked my single, sensible suitcase, a stark contrast to the opulence around me, and hung my clothes in the vast, empty closet. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I called the concierge and booked a deep tissue massage and a facial at the hotel's spa. The next 2 days were a blur of exquisite, selfish pleasure. I hired a private guide, a charming art history professor named Isabella, to take me through the Uffizi Gallery. Instead of being rushed past masterpieces, I stood for a full 30 minutes in front of Botticelli's Primavera, listening as Isabella explained the symbolism, the history, the heartbreaking beauty of it all. I wasn't just seeing it through Richard's eyes anymore. I was seeing it through my own. I discovered that I had an opinion, that I had a deep, personal connection to the art that had nothing to do with my husband's memory and everything to do with my own soul. After the gallery, I wandered through the city alone. I bought a cone of pistachio gelato and ate it on the steps of a piazza, not caring if it dripped on my chin. I walked the famed Ponte Vecchio, the bridge lined with glittering jewelry shops. In one window, a delicate gold bracelet with a single Florentine lily caught my eye. It was simple, elegant, and impossibly expensive. I walked in, and without a moment's hesitation, I bought it for myself. As the jeweler fastened it around my wrist, I saw it not as an extravagance but as a medal for bravery. That evening, I wore my new bracelet to dinner. I had a reservation for one at a Michelin-starred restaurant, a place where every dish was a work of art. As I sat there, savoring a perfectly seared scallop and sipping a glass of crisp vernaccia, my phone, which had been blissfully silent for 48 hours, buzzed on the table. It was a text from Jessica. The tone was a carefully crafted performance of casual, daughterly concern. "Mom, just wanted to check in. Did you get to the airport okay? Let me know when you land so I know you're safe." The audacity was breathtaking. They had abandoned me without a word, blocked my calls, and now, 2 days later, they were checking to see if their discarded luggage had made it safely back to its closet. They didn't want to know if I was safe. They wanted confirmation that their plan had worked, that I had scurried home, defeated and humiliated, leaving the rest of the trip and the money to them. I let the message sit there, unanswered through my main course and into dessert. I let them wait. I let them wonder. The power dynamic had shifted so completely it was almost intoxicating. Finally, as the waiter brought my espresso, I picked up the phone. I typed a simple, truthful reply. "Thank you for your concern, but I didn't go to the airport. Florence is absolutely lovely this time of year. I'm enjoying myself immensely." I hit send and turned my phone face down. I could almost feel the shockwave ripple across the 100 miles that separated us. The response came less than a minute later, a frantic series of messages that made my phone vibrate like an angry hornet. "What do you mean you're in Florence? Where are you staying? Mom, this is ridiculous. You need to stop this and come home. Are you out of your mind?" Then my phone started ringing. It was Jessica. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. A moment later, it rang again. "Tom." I declined the call. The messages continued, growing in panic and fury. "Helen, this is Tom. Your little stunt is not funny. You are wasting an obscene amount of money. That is our inheritance you are burning through on hotels and God knows what else." There it was, the truth in all its ugly, greedy glory, our inheritance. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about the money. They saw our family savings not as a tool for my comfort and security, but as a future down payment on their next car or a kitchen renovation. My well-being was an obstacle to their financial planning. A quiet, cold fury settled over me, eclipsing any lingering hurt. They had started this war. But I was the one with the superior firepower, the tactical advantage, and a will to win they had never imagined I possessed. I picked up my phone one last time, took a screenshot of Tom's revealing text message, and saved it. Then I blocked both of their numbers. I finished my espresso, paid the bill, leaving the waiter a generous tip, and walked out into the beautiful Florentine night. I stood on the bridge, the lights of the city glittering on the dark water of the Arno. I looked at the new bracelets sparkling on my wrist. They thought they had left me with nothing. They had, in fact, given me everything. I was the Queen of Florence, and my reign had just begun. The first few days in Florence were a blissful symphony of solitude and self-discovery. Blocking Jessica and Tom's numbers felt like closing a soundproof door on a room full of screaming. The silence was a balm. I woke when I wanted. I ate what I wanted. I went where I wanted. My schedule dictated only by my own whims and curiosities. I spent an entire afternoon in the Bobbly Gardens, not taking pictures, but simply sitting on a stone bench, reading a book of Italian poetry I had bought in a tiny shop. I felt my own spirit, long suppressed by the needs and demands of others, begin to unfurl like a spring fern. The woman who had been defined for 42 years as a wife, and for the last 35 as a mother, was finally, simply Helen. And I was beginning to realize that Helen was a rather interesting person to get to know. But I knew the peace wouldn't last. People like Tom do not accept a loss of control. They see it as a challenge, a declaration of war. If they could no longer attack me directly, they would simply find a new front. The attack came on a Thursday morning, via a call from my sister, Carol, back in Ohio. Her voice was a frantic jumble of panic and tears. "Helen, oh my God, I was so worried. Jessica just called me. She was hysterical. She said you had some sort of breakdown in Rome, that you ran off. She said you're not well, that you're spending all your money and they're just trying to get you home safely before you end up hurt or in debt. Helen, what is going on? Why won't you answer their calls?" I listened to the torrent of carefully constructed lies, my heart hardening not with anger at my sister, but with a cold, clear rage at the daughter who would so cruelly manipulate her. Jessica was weaponizing our family's love for me, twisting their concern into a tool for her own selfish agenda. This was Tom's strategy, I knew. He was trying to build a narrative, to paint me as a mentally unstable, vulnerable old woman, so that their actions would seem like a rescue rather than an abandonment. "Carol, I want you to take a deep breath and listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice perfectly calm and measured. "I have not had a breakdown. I am perfectly well. In fact, I haven't felt this clear-headed in years. Jessica and Tom abandoned me in our hotel in Rome 4 days ago. They took the car and left me a text message saying they were going on without me. I have decided to continue the vacation on my own." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Abandoned you?" Carol whispered, the words laced with disbelief. "Jessica would never. Helen, are you sure you didn't misunderstand?" She sounded so distraught. She was distraught because she has lost control, I stated flatly. And she is lying to you just as she has been lying to herself. One moment, Carol. I put the phone down, my movements precise. I found the screenshot I had taken of Tom's text in the restaurant in Florence, the one that spoke of their inheritance. I attached it to a message and sent it to my sister. I've just sent you a photo, I said, picking the phone back up. It's a text message from my son-in-law. Please read it, and then tell me if it sounds like it comes from a man who is concerned for my well-being. I waited, listening to the silence as my sister processed the ugly, greedy truth in black and white. When she spoke again, her voice was a low, guttural growl. That conniving little monster, she breathed. Their inheritance, as if you're already dead. And Jessica let him. Oh, Helen, I am so sorry. I can't believe I fell for it. It's not your fault, I said gently. They are very skilled manipulators, but now you know the truth. In that moment, the battlefield had shifted. I now had an ally, a general, back on the home front. They will likely call you again, Carol, I continued. They will have other stories, other lies. I just need you to run interference for me. I want to finish this trip in peace. This one last thing for Richard and for me. Don't you worry about a thing, Carol said, her voice now full of steel. You just take care of yourself. I'll handle them. I knew Tom wouldn't stop there. An emotional attack had failed. A financial one would be next. He was a man who believed every problem had a monetary pressure point. I spent the afternoon taking preventative measures, calling my bank and my main credit card company, informing them that I was traveling and to expect some unusual, but legitimate charges. It was a good thing I did. The next evening, I was having dinner at a lovely rooftop restaurant overlooking the Duomo when the attack came. I had just finished my meal and handed the waiter my credit card. He returned a few moments later, his face a mask of polite embarrassment. I am so sorry, Signora, he murmured. The card, it has been declined. A jolt of pure, cold panic shot through me. For a moment, the old, helpless Helen resurfaced. Was I cut off, stranded for real this time? But then the new Helen, the Queen of Florence, took over. I smiled calmly at the waiter. How silly of me, I must have grabbed the wrong one. Please try this one, I said, handing him my debit card, linked directly to the checking account I knew was flush with cash. The transaction went through without a problem. But as I walked back to my hotel through the glittering Florentine streets, my mind was racing. This was Tom's work. I could feel it. Back in the safety of my suite, I immediately called the 24-hour international number on the back of the declined credit card. After a series of security questions, a polite customer service agent told me what had happened. Yes, Mrs. Davison. A temporary hold was placed on the account this afternoon. We received a call from a Mr. Thomas Parker, who identified himself as your son-in-law. He expressed extreme concern, stating that you were elderly, traveling alone, and that your recent, erratic, and exorbitant spending suggested the card may have been stolen or that you were being taken advantage of. The sheer, slimy genius of it was almost impressive. He had used my age and my status as a widow against me, wrapping his financial sabotage in a cloak of feigned concern. I see, I said, my voice like ice. Let me be very clear. My son-in-law, Thomas Parker, and my daughter, Jessica Parker, are not to be trusted with any information regarding my accounts. They are, in fact, financially estranged from me. I want you to place a permanent note on my file. All security holds must be authorized by me, and only me, via a verbal security password. I set a new, complex password with the agent. Then I added my masterstroke. Furthermore, I want any future inquiries from either of those individuals to be flagged and reported to your fraud department as a potential attempt to gain unauthorized access to my finances. I hung up the phone, a grim satisfaction settling over me. I had parried his attack and built a new, stronger wall around my financial freedom. But I knew this was an escalation. They weren't just trying to bully me anymore. They were actively trying to incapacitate me, to cut my legs out from under me. My idyllic solo vacation had become a strategic chess match. I looked at the train tickets I had booked for the next morning. My final destination, Venice. The city of canals, of mazes, of dead ends. It was the perfect place for a final confrontation. I had a feeling they knew it too. They would try to intercept me there, to corner me, but I would be ready. They were coming for the weak, grieving widow they had abandoned in Rome. They would, instead, find the Queen of Florence, and the Queen was tired of playing defense. The train ride to Venice was a journey into a dream. As the industrial mainland gave way to the shimmering, impossible city rising from the lagoon, I felt a sense of destiny. Venice, the city of mazes and reflections, of opulent beauty and hidden decay, was the perfect stage for the final act of this drama. I was not afraid. The woman who had been terrified and alone in Rome was a distant memory. The woman who had found her power in Florence was now a strategist, heading into a battle of her own choosing. I checked into my hotel, a magnificent Gothic palace overlooking the Grand Canal, the water lapping gently against the ancient stone just below my balcony. I knew they would be here. They were hunters, and they had tracked their quarry to its final lair. But the hunter does not always have the advantage. Sometimes, the quarry is simply waiting to spring its own trap. Instead of hiding, I took control. I spent a quiet afternoon fortifying my position, making one last call to my sister Carol and another to my lawyer back home to ensure everything was in place. Then I unblocked Jessica's number. The bait had to be cast. My fingers were steady as I typed the message, every word chosen with surgical precision. Jessica, I have something for you. A token from your father's estate that I think you should have. Meet me tomorrow at noon. The outdoor terrace at Cafe Florian, Piazza San Marco. Please come alone. The phrase, father's estate, was the perfect lure for their greed. The public venue was my insurance against a scene, and the request to come alone was my final, silent test for my daughter. I sent the message and turned my phone off for the night. The trap was set. The next day, I arrived at Piazza San Marco a half-hour early. I chose a small table on the edge of the Cafe Florian terrace, a place steeped in centuries of history, and ordered a cappuccino. I was a solitary, elegant woman in a silk blouse, the Florentine lily bracelet glittering on my wrist. I was perfectly calm. At precisely 12:05, I saw them. Jessica was walking quickly, her face pale and anxious. And trailing a few steps behind her, a thundercloud of barely contained rage on his face, was Tom. My final test had been failed. My daughter was still a prisoner. They sat down without a word, Jessica refusing to meet my eyes, Tom glaring at me as if I were a hostile corporate takeover target. "All right, Helen, this little game is over," he began, his voice a low, aggressive growl. "We've booked you a flight back to Ohio for this evening. Your little adventure is done. You've caused this family enough embarrassment." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my cappuccino, letting his words hang in the air, stripped of their power by my utter indifference. "I'm not going anywhere, Tom," I said, my voice calm and pleasant. "And I'm not playing a game. I'm finishing the trip I paid for." I turned my gaze to my daughter. "I asked you to come alone, Jessica. It seems you are still incapable of making a single decision for yourself. A pity." Jessica flinched, but remained silent. "Cut the theatrics," Tom sneered. "You said you had something for us. What is it? A check, an apology?" "Something like that," I said, reaching into the elegant leather satchel at my side. I pulled out a large, crisp envelope and slid it across the small table. "A final accounting, you might say." With greedy, impatient fingers, Tom tore it open. He expected a peace offering, a surrender. His face, as he pulled out the first document, was a study in confusion, which quickly morphed into disbelief and then pure, unadulterated fury. The first page was not a check. It was a professionally printed invoice. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Invoice for services rendered and expenses incurred." Below was a meticulously itemized list, 2 round-trip business-class airfares, 3 nights accommodation, King's Suite, Rome, all meals and beverages, Rome, 1 half-day rental of premium vehicle. The grand total at the bottom was a staggering $18,452.38. "What the hell is this?" Tom hissed, his voice drawing a few curious glances from the surrounding tables. "That," I said calmly, "is your bill for the portion of the vacation you actually attended before you chose to abandon your host. I expect to be reimbursed in full within 30 days. Before he could explode, I gestured to the second document in his hand. "But that's not the token from your father's estate. That is." He snatched it up. It was a formal letter drafted on my lawyer's letterhead. He read it, his face turning a blotchy, unhealthy red. Jessica, finally looking up, read it over his shoulder, her hand flying to her mouth. a small, strangled gasp escaping her lips. The letter was a legally binding notice of intent. It stated that due to their actions of abandonment, emotional distress, and attempted financial harassment, I was immediately and irrevocably restructuring my will. All assets previously designated to my daughter, Jessica Parker, were to be placed into a managed trust. From this trust, she would receive a modest, fixed annual allowance, enough for a person to live on, but not nearly enough to fund a lifestyle of Brioni suits and designer handbags. Tom, as her spouse, was legally barred from having any access to or control over the principal. The vast remainder of my estate, upon my death, would be donated in its entirety to the Italian Art Preservation Fund, in the loving memory of my husband, Richard Davison. "You can't do this," Tom whispered, his voice shaking with a rage so profound it was almost silent. "It's already done," I replied. "You were so very concerned about your inheritance. You should have been more concerned with your character. You wanted your own trip. Well, you can start by paying me back for the first one." I finally looked at my daughter, whose eyes were now flooded with tears of genuine, catastrophic understanding. "I will always love you, Jessica," I said, my voice softening for the first time. "But I will no longer enable you or him. That small allowance from the trust is your lifeline. It will be more than enough for you to live on, should you ever find the courage to leave this man and start a life of your own. That is the last and best gift your father and I will ever give you." I stood up, leaving them sitting in stunned, horrified silence with the bill for their betrayal and the news of their disinheritance. I placed a €50 note on the table to cover my coffee and their stunned silence. Then, I turned and walked away, disappearing into the magical, bustling labyrinth of Venice. I did not look back. 6 months later, I am on the deck of a cruise ship, watching the sun set over the Aegean Sea. The trip is magnificent. My grief for Richard has softened into a warm, cherished memory, and my life is my own, full and vibrant. 2 weeks ago, I received a letter. It was from Jessica. She has left Tom. She is living in a small apartment, working as a substitute teacher, the job she had and loved before he convinced her it was beneath her. She did not ask for money. She did not ask for forgiveness. She simply told me about her life, and at the end she wrote, "I think I am finally learning to breathe again. I hope one day you will teach me how." The future is uncertain. The damage is deep. But for the first time, my daughter is standing on her own 2 feet. I have not only saved myself, I have given her the chance to save herself too. I raise my glass to the setting sun, to Richard, and to the breathing marble. The journey is far from over. And I can't wait to see where I go next.